All right, this is episode number 8 of Into the Absurd with David Goodwin. All right, what is felony disenfranchisement?
So, felony disenfranchisement in the United States is defined as the suspension or withdrawal of voting rights due to conviction of a criminal offense. Essentially, it just means that people who are convicted felons lose the right to vote upon, going to jail or going to prison or just being convicted in the court process. There's a lot of debate on this topic, specifically dealing with the moral grounds of it, or specifically if felons should be able to vote at all, or at what stage in their conviction process they should be able to vote. There's also talk of does the social contract justify felon disenfranchisement, and also talks of distributive justice, which is that there must be some administrative inputs in the United States that are sound if there's ever to be outcomes that are just. Essentially, this just means in the United States that we need just systems to ensure just outcomes. Mm-hmm. And so when we're talking about the United States elections, specifically primary or national elections, suppressing the vote of some peoples may trigger a fault in this distributive justice.
And could you kind of go into the social contract theory before we dive into this?
Yeah, for sure. So there's a couple different ways people use, a couple different frameworks people use to justify felon disenfranchisement or felony disenfranchisement. One of them would be the social contract. So just very briefly, and I'm no expert on this, but there's...
That's right.
yeah. There's Rousseau, Locke, and Hobbes, right? They all have this idea that individuals offer sovereignty up to an organization or a collective, and eventually this turns into a government type of system. They surrender individual sovereignty, meaning that they give up some freedoms in order to guarantee themselves safety. Mm-hmm. So in modern day, this kind of looks like, when you're born in the United States, you don't sign a formal contract, like it's no written contract. But if you live in the United States, you have to abide by the laws, and if you break the laws, you're punished for that. And that's kind of what the modern social contract is applied to the United States today. So I'm going to be going over some not so fun stuff, so just being like the facts of the case and the different issues surrounding the topic, and then eventually we'll be able to dive into the fun stuff or the philosophical issues. But it's really important to understand the ramifications of felony disenfranchisement before actually delving into if it's right or wrong, because if you don't really know if it's right or wrong yet, it's really difficult to take a position, I guess, just without the evidence purely. So as an intro, I'm going to talk with some facts and also my position as just a disclaimer. So the Sentencing Project finds that in the 2016 presidential election, over 6 million American citizens were prohibited from voting due to laws that disenfranchised citizens convicted of felony offenses. This topic is charged with philosophical debate, right? But before, like I said, having any fun, we have to understand what this is all about. And just purely as a disclaimer, I present the topic in kind of a descriptive and normative manner, although I have a very strong position and I want to make that clear. I believe that American citizens ought to be able to vote. It should be an inalienable right and expressed freely rather than some type of revocable right. And I understand that a lot of people don't hold this position. That's great. I think I like to hear from other people. I constantly ask other people what their position is. And I'll do my best to accurately portray both sides of the discussion with some objectivity. But I just want to give a little disclaimer there. Today we'll be talking about a few different things. So first, obviously the facts. We'll talk about the historical developments of felony status, conviction status, that being like imprisonment, parole, probation, or post-sentence. We'll talk about how some different states formulate these laws and what they look like today. And then we'll talk about how different people in the political atmosphere today justify these laws. Eventually we'll get to the fun stuff, which is the philosophical debate, and that shouldn't take too long. So first I want to just ask, this is something I ask a lot of my friends when I'm trying to begin this discussion. So Greg, do you think felons should be able to vote? And if so, at what stage in their conviction should they be allowed to vote?
I do think that they should be allowed to vote. And at what stage in their conviction should they be allowed to vote? Me personally, as soon as they get out of prison. Mm-hmm. The moment they step foot outside of the prison, that's when they should be allowed to vote. Whether you're on probation or not, as soon as you're outside of that prison, you should be allowed to vote.
Okay, yeah. A lot of people take that position that are advocating for the restoring of rights. I know I'll get into it, but I know there's only 2 states that let you vote while in prison. I believe that being Maine and Vermont. They're able to vote regardless of criminal status. It's just, they're called unrestricted voting states. I share a similar line of reasoning, but I think you should be able to vote regardless of conviction status. Purely being that I don't think being in prison makes you any less of a human or a citizen of the United States. Obviously, you're losing some rights and you're losing some freedom being, in the system. But I don't see how individuals in the system are enabled to express their political beliefs or their ideological preferences while in prison. I think that requires some talking about, but I largely agree with that as well. So we'll talk about some interesting developments over the years. So I'm no expert on ancient Greece or Athenian democracy, don't quote me here, but I do know that people that were convicted criminals in Athens in ancient Greece did lose their rights. They weren't able to participate politically, and I know that a lot of people in ancient Greece weren't able to participate politically, right? Like I'm pretty sure actually I'm not even sure what it is. I'm pretty sure it was just men. But
Yeah, I think it was male property owners.
yeah, I think it was male property owners. Yeah, exactly. Eventually, yeah, I guess that's how it worked, right? As male property owners, and they would be stripped of their rights to vote or participate politically. Then we go to medieval Europe, and that's where this concept of civil or civic death spawns from. So the idea is that once you violate the laws, or you lose in court, or you kill someone, right? Some convicted offense, you lose, I guess, all your ties to the state you're in, I guess, right? You're no longer protected by the state. It's a strict interpretation of the social contract theory, thereby meaning when you commit a criminal offense, you are no longer protected by the state, and essentially it boils down to anyone can kill you. Mm-hmm. And that may sound pretty stark, but that's just the way it was. Civil death is the loss of all or almost all civil rights by a person due to a conviction for a felony or due to an act by the government of a country that results in the loss of civil rights. This obviously was in Athens, but truly civil death originated in medieval Europe. It meant that any citizen could publicly execute a felon with impunity due to felon's status as a reject of society. So this was a little messed up. Maybe it was justified, I don't know, I didn't live in medieval Europe, but if you're a convicted felon, you could be publicly executed and there would be no repercussions for any party involved. Obviously it's not like that quite today, but it has developed over the years. We go to the Mayflower and we get to the United States and post-Revolutionary War when we're state building. We developed the same ideas out of medieval Europe in England, being people that are felons should not be able to participate in the same conduct or manner that non-felons do, right? We don't want to, like, quote-unquote, corrupt the system. So it transpired over the years, and in the 1890s, the courts ended up suppressing the black vote by specifying felony offenses that were thought to be largely perpetrated by African Americans. Now this is rather interesting, right? Lawmakers and legislators decided that they would want to suppress the black vote, for whatever personal interest reason there is out there. And to do such, they ended up localizing some misdemeanors and turning them into felony offenses, which in turn would focus on one target group and suppress their vote, right? If you're a felony, you can no longer vote. And this was largely commonplace in the late 1800s when this was taking place. Now, there's a lot of different talk about where states are at today, and so it's a little confusing, right? So what it boils down to is that felony disenfranchisement is not a federal law. It's a law that originates in the state legislature. And so we have all these different laws and constantly changing laws. I think Florida recently changed in 2018 their voting rights laws that change who can vote and at what stage in their conviction process they can vote. So there's 4 different main things I need to talk about in this area just to explain it, and that being imprisonment, parole, probation, and post-sentence. Imprisonment would be an individual is physically confined to a state institution, right, just in prison. Parole would be much later in the conviction process. It's granted by a parole board after the offender has served some time in prison, or perhaps sometimes a lot of time. Probation is handed down by the judge at the time of sentencing. It doesn't have to come with jail time, but it can. The judge will specify restrictions on the offender's activities during the probationary period. And then we have post-sentence, which is all the time spent out of the conviction process. After you've gone through parole, probation, or imprisonment, just being a regular citizen in the United States, living your life, doing your job. Post-sentence encapsulates all the time afterwards. So now we get into some state policies. Like I said earlier, Maine and Vermont are the only states where convicted felons are allowed to vote regardless of criminal status. Unrestricted voting states is what they're called. There are 18 states that only prohibit felons from voting while physically incarcerated, or i.e. in prison. There are 3 states that prohibit felons from voting while in prison or on parole. There are 17 states that prohibit felons from voting while in prison, on parole, or on probation, so that being that they can vote post-sentence. And there are 11 states that prohibit felons from voting at any time in their lives. However, it must be noted that, like I said, like Florida, for instance, in the last 4 years, there's been a lot of reform taking place. So in these last 11 states that prohibited them from voting any time in their lives, the data has changed recently in the last 4 years. There are a lot of issues with felony disenfranchisement, right? We have suppressing the black vote, which is a topic with a lot of literature online. It's just simple. It's that reinforces structural racism by suppressing the voices of African Americans uniquely. Something that's really interesting and must be talked about is the 2000 election with Bush v. Gore, right? So we have Florida. It boils down to Florida, right? And I'm not talking here about the Chads or the hanging Chads, right? I'm talking about specifically who is able to vote. Now, when it comes down to it, I'm not sure. Do you know the exact number? I think it was 550-ish people. I guess the voting difference.
Yeah, I actually don't know.
I think it's a little over 500. It might be like 550-ish, but I know it's between 500 and 600. And that was votes that decided the election. Specifically in Florida, where this all took place, 15% of the black population was not able to vote. So when you factor in, the commonly referenced notion that African Americans are more likely to vote Democratic, and I'm not saying that's correct or not correct. I am not an expert in that area, but there's a lot to be said about, if that 15% of the black vote was able to actually vote, it could have actually swayed towards Gore, and it wouldn't have been such a close election. That's all speculation, and who's to say what, but
take with that what you will.
Yeah, do that what you will. Has serious implications for our democracy nonetheless. In 2016, I believe that's where the over 6 million number comes from. I believe over 6 million Americans were unable to vote. And I'm not sure in 2020. We don't have the specific numbers yet in 2020. We probably won't get that for another half a year. But soon enough, we'll have the juicy data. But now we can finally get into how people justify these policies, these state policies. So a lot of this evidence ends up coming from Ream in 2005 in his article, Liberal and Republican Arguments Against the Disenfranchisement of Felons. I don't want to twist these arguments, and I don't want to use too charged of language here because I know a lot of people take this to heart, but I'm going to refer to the Republicans probably as the right and the Democrats as the left, because they justify felony disenfranchisement in different ways. And yes, they both justify it, saying that felons shouldn't be able to vote, but they do so a little differently. So first, I'm going to start with the left. The argument generally presented by them is that felons have violated the social contract, thus forfeiting their political rights. This is what I would call a strict interpretation of the social contract theory, but I'll get into that a little more later. The right generally justifies it by saying that felons have demonstrated a lack of civic virtue, which is necessary for the proper exercise of the right to vote. And actually, I have a fun little quip from Senator Mitch McConnell in 2002, right? This is following to the 2000 elections a couple of years later, and this was a speech over a bill to secure federal voting rights to ex-felons. Mitch McConnell said, "Voting is a privilege properly exercised at the voting booth, not from a prison cell. States have a significant interest in reserving the vote for those who abided by the social contract that forms the foundation of a representative democracy. He goes on to say, those who break our laws should not have a voice in electing those who make and enforce our laws. Those who break our laws should not dilute the vote of law-abiding citizens. So while the left may defend felony disenfranchisement, saying, once you commit a heinous crime or some felonious behavior, right, you lose the ability to vote. Is just one of the many rights you lose. While the Republicans believe kind of a prehistoric notion of what felons look like, I guess, them being that they're not necessarily less than human, but they don't have the ability to make rational or like keen decisions. And so, real quick, before I move on to social contract, I want to talk about this a little bit. So, first off, the social contract theory, the justification on the left, I take issue with this. So, I think the social contract theory underscores the importance of the right to vote. An application of this framework to this debate, the felony disenfranchisement debate, it also kind of holds that thieves should be tattooed on the forehead with a large T. Kind of like a prehistoric notion, like medieval Europe, right? I take issue with this because I don't think it requires such a strict interpretation. The social contract can be used to justify a litany of laws in the United States. I don't think there's any issue with that. I think a lot of laws are justified under their social contract theory. But specifically for this scenario in voting rights, I think it doesn't adequately capture what the state legislators are trying to put forth. That being that felons shouldn't be able to vote. I don't think the social contract theory really, clarifies the limits to what rights you can restrict or how far you can restrict them. I think it's underscored in the social contract theory in the literature from Locke, Rousseau, and Hobbes, but also that, we don't abide by, in the United States, we don't really abide by such a strict interpretation anymore. I mean, law is constantly developing and changing, but I think as it continues to do such, we'll move away from that more and more, and I think we are currently. Second, on the social contract theory, it supports the ideas should actually have the right to vote when they complete their sentence. In the United States, we're not such strict social contract interpreters that felons don't emerge back into society, right? After you complete your sentence, probation, parole, imprisonment, whatever it is, after that, it might be more difficult to get a job, right? But you are reintegrated into society by some measure, right? And I think you can't successfully reintegrate individuals into society under the United States system without voting rights, right? Let's say an individual is imprisoned for, let's say, any illegal act, right? When they're imprisoned and they lose their right to vote, let's say it becomes a moral issue, right? So they knew it was wrong, but they had to do it, right? Maybe it's they are, I don't know, trafficking insulin across national borders, whatever. Say it's some normative issue. It doesn't even have to be that scenario, but when it comes down to it, these individuals made a rational decision to do such, and once they've completed their the entire conviction process, they have to be reintegrated in a way that permits them to make change in the society they live in, right? If they want to make change, maybe disobeying the law wasn't the best way to do it, and obviously not everyone can do that and abide by the laws. But the only way to actually change, and people that feel the most convicted to change such laws are those that have been affected by them. And so I think when you take away that population of people that feel convicted to strike down these laws, then you don't have much of a fighting force. It becomes a tool, a political tool for state legislators to ensure that they stay in power and laws look what they want them to look like rather than the people they represent. Permanent social reform means treating felons like normal citizens. Without this reciprocity, the social order is doomed to disorder and entropy. The social contract aims for stabilizing groups of people, and if people disobey the social contract, we don't kill them anymore, right? We rehabilitate them or imprison them, and that's an entirely different debate. But if we're ever to move towards a system that correctly fixes, or if we're ever to move towards a better prison system or a better voting rights system, it has to start with recognizing that there are groups that are disproportionately affected by the current laws in the United States. And when we address these, we can then start applying better frameworks than what I would call a strict interpretation of the social contract theory. Now, on the right, I take issue with the lack of civic virtue argument for, I guess, similar reasons. Uh, the notion stems from an oddly accepted exaggeration that felons are vastly different from law-abiding citizens. Um, right, so it stems from this idea that if you're a felony, you you are less than a non-felon, right? Um, I mean, I think this is just morally corrupt, maybe bankrupt, but um, and this is changing, right? Less and less people feel this way or think this way. But I think it's still entrenched in the political process where, felons shouldn't have the right to vote or to hold office or vote. This boils down to felons not being rational actors, and I think a lot of the time felons are rational actors. Um, but yeah, I just think this is stretched too far. I don't think felons are any less of people, and I think a lot of the times they and not all the time, right? But a lot of the time they get in trouble for things that maybe they don't think they should have, or society generally thinks they shouldn't have, but they did, like trafficking marijuana or holding marijuana in a non-legalized state, for instance. Um,
Which for more or less doesn't really affect anyone.
yeah, exactly. Um, I mean, yeah, it really only affects who chooses to disobey and who chooses to go against the law. Um, and there is debate here about what like felonious behavior, and that word's really funny to me, so I use it. But what felony acts constitute maybe anti-virtuous behavior. Um, so like murder or like mass murder or whatever, rape. What kind of felony acts should be used to prohibit voting rights per se. Like I'm not advocating that all felons should keep their rights. Some rights must be stripped to protect society, right? So maybe restricting the ability to own a gun for felons is the ultimate good. I'm not really sure on that, but I think overall there are some rights that felons should lose. I'm not an expert in that area. I'm only really curious about felony disenfranchisement, but voting rights are integral to democratic functions and are seemingly harmless, right? Like no one's gonna. I mean, there are people that vote like as a troll, right? So like Kanye West, and people voting for Kanye West, right? But I don't think anyone with like real intentions to participate in the democratic process or like with real political interest, like can manipulate their vote in a way that really affects or negatively affects like the election. Like for instance, I don't know, people that smoke marijuana, like they're not any less intelligent or any less capable of making it like a qualified voting decision in any election, right? It just boils down to what we think of felons overall. And I'm not saying like they're all marijuana smokers and that are felons, right? But there are a substantial number of them. What's really interesting is I was talking about Florida earlier. So in 2018, they reformed voting laws to restore rights to most felons. There's a caveat there, I'm not really sure what it is, but it's most felons except for murderers and sex offenders. And I agree with this method of reform and think at a minimal it's a step in the right direction. I think this takes some explicating because I say all people should be able to vote, and now I'm saying no, just not sex offenders or murderers. And I think what it boils down to is not applying the social contract theory in a way that fits me, right? I think a lot of people personalize this and say like, oh, in my experience is like, yeah, I should be this way. I think what it boils down to is some acts go against universal moral codes, right? When you break those acts, or when you break those codes, rather, you violate the social contract on a deeper level, rather than maybe some issue, some moral issue you have in the state, right? So it's always easiest to compare, like, let's say, like, I don't know, like cocaine or heroin, right? Usage, and I know not all states do this now, but let's say it's a felony, right? You can't really equate people who are addicted and use heroin to sex offenders. And I think that requires deeper explanation. But what it boils down to for me is that people that want to change the political system, if they want to participate politically, they just need to be a part of general principles of humanity. And I think there are some general principles of humanity. Maybe it's like international humanitarian law or some like General Assembly BS. But I think there are some felony offenses that you should not retain the right to vote. And I think one thing that really brought me to this step was I was listening to a podcast, and it was a felon. He was convicted on marijuana charges, and he talked about how there's this really interesting process that goes on. Is individuals, they get in trouble, they're imprisoned, they lose their voting rights, and now they can't change the system anymore. So when you have that proportion or that population that feel the strongest about the subject and actually want to make change, they no longer are able to vote on the change. And I think this doesn't really exist for murderers and sex offenders, right? Like no one's advocating for this, and there's not like some group that I know about at least that's like politically pushing for this or lobbying for it. And so what it boils down for me, I guess overall, is that most felons should have their voting rights restored. And I think that's really the only way to push forward our democracy and ensure participation. And I know there's one line of reasoning that I don't really want to get too deep into, but I've had, when I have this discussion with different people, they say, hey, like, I would want to know if felons were able to vote, how many of them actually would, like how many of them actually care. And I think it's important to address this line of reasoning, not because it's substantial, a lot of people think this way, but it really wraps your head around, like why this is important. It's not so much that, it's gonna change the outcome of the election, or, it's like, it's gonna change some laws. The reason they should be able to vote is because it's a right, as a citizen of the United States, to do so in order to ensure democratic prosperity, right? It's not so much of a, like, will they vote, or like, they're not even gonna vote, like, why give them the rights back? It's not if they will, it's if they should have the ability to. And I think that ability is key to free and fair elections, right? I think if you have some groups that aren't able to vote, then you're not representing what the people want. And for a lot of states that have really strict voting laws, that becomes an extremely prominent issue. So there are a couple more interesting things with the social contract theory, though. So there's four basic tenets that kind of are brought up in Locke's interpretation. Yes, like the three major social contract theories have slightly different interpretations, like including Plato in I can't remember.
The Republic.
No, it's not the Republic.
Right?
It starts with a C. It's not Crete. It's Credo or something. I'm not quite sure.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, but this comes from Locke, and so the four basic tenets here would be punishment. Four basic tenets of punishment, right? The aims of punishment are incapacitation, retribution, deterrence, and rehabilitation. Now, there's a lot to be said about what our prison system is good and bad at, right? But I think when we're applying Locke's interpretation of the social contract theory, we see that, sure, incapacitation, imprisonment, retribution, maybe deterrence, maybe like some crimes are harder than others, and rehabilitation, there essentially is none for felons that are no longer able to vote. And I think felony disenfranchisement in this framework, at least, does not fit under Locke's social contract theory. And so the way people justify their positions on felony disenfranchisement with this interpretation of the social contract theory is a little skewed. Rousseau takes it a little differently, right? So Rousseau sees punishment, right, like being imprisoned or whatever it is, punishment as a means to ensure obedience, not a civic death. So he was aware, with the ideas of civic death. But his is much more of we need rehabilitation programs in the form of like education, religious study, job training, and or drug training programs. Hobbes also was a little similar in this area, that being, if you violate the social contract, like you probably shouldn't be executed, but there has to be something done. Like there has to be some deterrence mechanism or rehabilitation mechanism to ensure that like, people are properly reintegrated into society and can uh, offer their sovereignty into the collective good. I think. I
Well,
mean, go ahead.
it's not helping anyone if these prisoners are getting out of prison and then they can't vote and they're not rehabilitated. They just spent the past, 25 years just resenting being in there, and now they get out and then they reoffend. Right? We're not really properly rehabilitating them and putting them back into the economy to actually be a good citizen.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the United States prison system is obviously not that great. Yeah, without saying, but yeah, I mean, when it comes down to what they can do, right? To maybe someone was properly convicted of an offense they believe shouldn't be a law. When they're out, like maybe they can make their story public and like garner some like public support for their like I don't know change in the United States, but them not being able to vote is it's really just boils down to being a political tool used by the elites or the state legislators to ensure that the laws don't change or that the people's views aren't reflected. And I think you're exactly right in saying when they come out of prison they have that pent up rage that they can't do anything with it. They can't change anything. And I mean, obviously that's understated. They can change things, right? Anyone can change anything, but not having the right to vote strips you of that identity or motivation politically, and
It also alienates you.
yeah, exactly. I mean, not only I think like not only being a registered felon, but also just not being a voter is it just must be a different feeling. I mean, I'm not a felon, but it just must be a different feeling, right? It makes you feel like you're not part of the system you're contractually obligated to be a part of, maybe. So we have a couple questions we started with. That being, should felons be able to vote, and if so, if not, at what stage in their conviction should they be allowed to vote? Like I said, I think most felons should have their voting rights restored. I think Florida's a system or reform has been largely successful. Florida has restored the rights to over 1.6 million citizens, I believe, in Florida alone, from their 2018 reforms. So I think people are generally moving in the right area. Obviously, there can be more to be done there in any sector of the United States. There can always be more to be done, but I think if we're ever going to get any tangible success, it has to start with giving everyone the right to vote. And I think regardless of conviction status, right? Like, I think even while in prison, I don't see much of an argument for why you shouldn't be able to vote in prison. I mean, yeah, you lose, essentially everything but the right to life in prison. And I mean, it can be argued that you lose that even, but if voting rights are inalienable, like I think at least, I really don't see any obstacles to letting felons vote in prison. I think, if you're in prison and you want to make change, the only real way to do it is to vote in that situation. And for a lot of people, that's the only real way to make any change. And so, I don't see any issue with voting on parole, probation, imprisonment. I think it all just is, the same thing. I think everyone should be able to vote, or I guess most groups should have their voting rights restored at least. But how are you feeling?
I definitely think that as far as convicted felons go, you should have the right to vote the moment you step out of prison, like I said earlier. Mainly because if we strip the rights to vote from felons, if the government strips the right to vote from felons, and the government is the one that makes our laws, that creates our laws and creates the laws that allow someone to even become a felon, then what are they going to make a felony next, right? What are they going to put out there to put you in prison and then take away your voting rights, right? So it just kind of, it it's kind of a slippery slope, at least to me.
Yeah, I could definitely see that. I know I have some friends that have shared their opinions on this, and I mean it ranges from they should not have rights to they should have all rights, all ends of the spectrum. But um, I have people that say that at least argue that they should only have voting rights restored in the post sentence or the post sentence era, right when they're out of parole, probation, imprisonment. And I think this is interesting because this is like the core of reintegration, right? When you're not in the system necessarily anymore, you might have a felony status, but you're doing your best to work yourself back into society. And I think it's a strong argument to say that maybe you shouldn't. I guess that at least it's just an argument to say that you shouldn't be able to vote on parole or probation because you're still learning how to readjust or how to resign yourself to the social contract of the United States today. The issue I take with that is that these people that were in prison, they're adults and they're rational actors in the United States. When it comes down to it, I don't think being on parole or probation makes you any less an individual or any less capable to make such decisions. And I think you sound like you agree on that too. And so what's interesting to me is that these states vary so much on when felons should get the rights to vote, if at all.
And I mean, I'm definitely not for, murderers and rapists to have the right to vote.
Yeah.
But I mean, everyone else.
yeah. Well, it's complex, right? Because they're humans too, and what separates, like these different actors or these different individuals from other individuals, right? I mean, obviously, the acts they commit that separates them and what they're convicted of. But like an argument can be made here is that like if they're sane individuals or psychologically sane or evaluated as sane, that even if they are a murderer per se, that they should still be able to vote. And I think at least for me, there are some acts that are unforgivable, and I'm not necessarily an eye for an eye kind of person. But at the same time, I think there are acts that are unforgivable, right? You can't go back on them, you can't reverse them, and permanently damaging another's life in some significant way like this, you will lose some rights, and sometimes it's life in prison, or maybe it has to be loss of voting rights. But I think some acts are so drastic, or I want to say twisted, but I mean, obviously there's a lot of psychological issues with the perpetrators of the acts that it might be harmful to say that, but there's a lot of issues at play here that just make it so complicated to justify the removal of their rights. That being said, I'd have to say that anything that is so extreme that it is terrifying. They forfeit their rights. They're not just disobeying a law because they think the law is bad. They're doing it out of some personal vengeance or vendetta or something. And I think that kind of rational act is what needs to be punished. And there's no stronger way to deter it than stronger punishment. And maybe that is the removal of voting rights.
All right, David. Well, it was good learning from you, and thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was a good time, and I hope more people at least start talking about this. I think it's a pressing issue, and even if you're not that interested, at least being informed is really important today.
For all you out there that if you have any suggestions, or you want to suggest someone to come onto the podcast, or if you want to suggest something for me to research, just email into.the.absurd.podcast@gmail.com. Thank you for listening.